Great. I'll go ahead and get started. Well, thank you, Chip, for that introduction. Appreciate it. And as Chip said, I'm going to be talking about stakeholder insights into reef habitat and fish abundance based on interviews we conducted as part of the Red Snapper research program. Talking to fishery stakeholders that are involved in the reef fishery in the U.S. South Atlantic Federal Fisheries Management Region. And before I get started or leave this slide, I wanted to thank the considerable inputs of all my co-authors listed on this slide. This was a true team effort. The individual not listed on this slide that also made a very substantial contribution to this project is Dr. Nathan Hostetter at the U.S. Geological Survey in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I wanted to acknowledge his considerable efforts on this chapter of the Red Snapper research project. So a couple background topics before we get started and dive into specifically why me and my co-authors investigated reef fish distribution and reef habitat distribution on the U.S. South Atlantic continental shelf. The first, as many of you in the audience know, survey data collection is also often limited and incomplete in the world's large marine ecosystems. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, this also applies to the U.S. South Atlantic Federal Fisheries Management Region. However, local ecological knowledge can help understand distribution patterns of marine resources to help better inform management of these marine resources in places like the U.S. South Atlantic Management Region. And using local ecological knowledge to understand resource distribution abundance can also help stakeholder buy-in in managing marine resources. We've seen a lot of cases, for example, up in New England off of Georges Bank and managing those groundfish resources up there, as far as incorporating stakeholders in those management strategies up in that particular fishery, and that certainly based on the many publications into that fishery has enhanced stakeholder buy-in into managing those resources. So there's a real advent in the management process to incorporating stakeholders, not only in the research part of the process, but also when it comes to that will increase buy-in when it comes to managing marine resources such as reef habitats and the fishes that rely on them. So we had a couple reasons for undertaking this study. As Chip said at the outset this afternoon, this particular chapter was part of the program over the last several years, the federally funded program to estimate the absolute abundance of red snapper in the U.S. South Atlantic continental shelf region. One of the things that was really required to really drill down on a refined estimate of red snapper absolute abundance in the region was to get an idea of natural reef habitats. However, it's still to this day the spatial distribution of natural reef habitats in the U.S. South Atlantic Federal Fisheries Management Region remains to some degree to be uncertain based on published reports. Is it 3%? Is it 6%? Is it above 6%? So one of the reasons we undertook this study is to see, were there any gaps that we were missing in our coverage of the spatial distribution of natural reef habitats based on what expert opinion from fishery stakeholders were reporting in the region. And so we wanted to provide a more comprehensive snapshot, if you will, via interviewing fishery stakeholders to see if there are any additional areas of reef habitat that were currently unknown or remain currently unknown via the Southeast Reef Fish Survey or SAFMC annual federally funded fishery-independent survey monitoring program, where they set chevron traps and associated camera equipment on to conduct their annual summertime reef fish survey in the U.S. South Atlantic continental shelf on hard bottom natural reef habitats. So our objective in this study was quite simply to determine whether fishery stakeholder insights into natural reef habitats and fish distribution could cooperate estimates of these resources via published estimates from model fitting to fishery independent survey data. So here is the focal habitat type, species, and management area that I'm going to be talking about. This species, no surprise that we drilled down on in this study using fishery stakeholder interviews, was the red snapper. As Chip previously discussed, this was part of the red snapper absolute abundance estimation project. I don't need to give a really long introduction to the species. Most people in the audience are intimately familiar with this species. It's a quick to mature but long-lived animal as part of the 55 species reef fish complex in the U.S. South Atlantic Federal Fisheries Management Region. It's found in waters roughly 20 to 100 meters deep in the U.S. South Atlantic and also the Gulf. It's got a really rich and extensive management history. And currently, based on the most recent assessment earlier this decade, it's still overfished. That is, the biomass is too low, and it's overfishing is still occurring. That is, the rate of removals is still currently too high based on that most recent assessment, with a new assessment forthcoming shortly. The region we worked in is the U.S. South Atlantic continental shelf. As I previously described, it's considered one of the world's large marine ecosystems, and that part of the U.S. South Atlantic between 10 and 200 meters deep encompasses an area of roughly 103,000 square kilometers. And like I said, there's these lingering and nagging questions regarding how much reef habitat coverage is there in the region, this natural reef habitat coverage that supports this very rich community of reef fishes in the region. So we had two very discrete parts of the methods, and I want to dive into them in a little bit of detail over the next couple slides, because that sets the table for understanding the results and looking at the maps results in a little bit more detail, which I'll get to in some later slides. The first part of the methods included collecting interview data. We interviewed both commercial and recreational fishermen that had intimate knowledge of the U.S. South Atlantic reef fishery. And when we conducted these interviews, fishermen categorized their fishing effort, natural reef habitat relative abundance, and red snapper relative abundance on gridded maps. And each of the grid cells in those maps measured 5 minutes latitude by 5 minutes longitude. And each respective fisherman that we interviewed only filled out maps in the respective fishing zones in the greater U.S. South Atlantic Federal Fisheries Management Region, which, like Chip told us at the introduction this afternoon, spans from the North Carolina-Virginia border all the way throughout the Lower Keys in Florida. And on these gridded maps, each interviewee, if he had experience in a particular grid cell, prior fishing experience, each interviewee filled out habitat and red snapper scores in each grid cell as 0, no natural reef habitat or red snapper, 1, low abundance, 2, moderate abundance, or 3, high abundance. We tried to keep these categorizations that each interviewee filled out on these gridded maps as fairly broad or generic, if you will, to have some consistency amongst all the interviewees that were filling out this information as part of the red snapper project. So this is just one example of a gridded map that we used as part of this project. Like I told you earlier, if you, in your mind's eye, extend this same type of gridded map northward to the North Carolina-Virginia border and southward throughout the Florida Keys, similar gridded maps were provided to other fishermen that didn't work in this particular zone, as pictured for an example on the right-hand side of the slide. This particular example, some of you might be familiar with this if you fish off the coast of North Carolina. Really, the heart of this map, pictured on the right-hand side of the slide, is Onslow Bay, North Carolina, the middle blob in the map, and then to the west of Cape Fear. There, of course, is Longs Bay off towards the South Carolina, North Carolina border, and off to the northeast side of the map, just to orient you, is Raleigh Bay, North Carolina. So in these interviews, we collected data from 10 to 150 meters deep. Put another way, the shoreward edge of each interview grid cell map was 10 meters deep, and the seaward edge was 150 meters deep. And based on a myriad of publications understanding the spatial distribution of red snapper on the US South Atlantic continental shelf, we felt really confident that we were capturing in that depth zone the full depth distribution of red snapper on the US South Atlantic continental shelf. We conducted both remote and in-person interviews as part of this project. And the grid cell size we felt was a real balance. We really struggled with this initially, and Captains Wayne Dotson and Terrell Gould up in Morehead City, North Carolina, they were a big help in helping us refine the grid cell size before we even commenced the interview process. And what we wanted to do in using the 5-minute latitude by 5-minute longitude grid cell size is balance two competing interests. You can imagine one of the competing interests, if this chapter of the Red Snapper Research Project, as it was intended to make sure that we're accounting for reef habitat distribution on the shelf. We wanted to have some type of granularity, if you will, or spatial specificity into the grid cell size that would lead to us wanting a finer grid cell size. However, we also wanted to protect the privacy of individual fishing locations or individual GPS fishing spots. So we didn't want to have too much granularity into the grid cell size to protect it, that privacy or to address that privacy concern. And what we ultimately ended up with in consultation with Captains Dotson and Gould up in Morehead City, North Carolina, was that 5x5 grid cell size that I mentioned on the previous slide. So that's first part of the methods was interviewing commercial and recreational fishery stakeholders to get their ideas into the spatial distribution on the shelf in the South Atlantic, into natural reef habitats and red snapper relative abundance. The second part of the methods was to collect estimates of these reef habitats and red snapper distribution from model fitting to fishery-independent survey data. So we used 3 separate bodies of work to collect that information. Reef habitat estimates were converted to proportional estimates of natural reef abundance within each grid cell by using the Stewart et al. Paper, which I reference here in the top bullet on this slide. This was a paper that was published 4 years ago, and we converted those reef habitat estimates into a proportional coverage within each 5x5, 5-minute latitude by 5-minute longitude grid cell on each interview map. Predictions of red snapper relative abundance were collected from modeled estimates that were fitted to data collected by Nate Batchelor and his colleagues at NOAA from his fishery-independent video camera trap surveys. And again, each of Nate's predictions, Nate and his colleagues' predictions from his generalized additive models were averaged within each interview grid cell. And finally, the bottom bullet on this slide, predictions of red snapper absolute abundance were collected from the current red snapper absolute abundance estimation project that Chip introduced at the outset this afternoon. And those absolute abundance estimates were also converted to an absolute value within each 5x5 interviewee grid cell. So now let's dive into some results. And before I swan dive into the results and looking at these very colorful maps, I wanted to give you a little bit of background of what you're looking at. So the appearance of the next 6 slides is going to be similar. On the left-hand side of each of the next 6 slides, you're going to see the mapped interview information. The right-hand side of each of the next 6 slides, you're going to see the modeled estimates from model fitting exercises to the fishery-independent data, either on natural reef habitat or red snapper relative abundance or red snapper absolute abundance. So interview information on the left-hand map, modeled estimates on the right-hand map, where you're going to see holes or gaps in the coverage, for example, in each of these 2 respective maps, like off the South Carolina, Virginia border. Those are areas where we were unable to collect any stakeholder information via the interview process. The lighter shades in each of the maps, those lighter shades of yellow and light orange juice colored gridding, are those areas, those grid cells where we had lesser abundances of either reef habitat or red snapper, regardless of whether it's talking about interview information or modeled estimates. The darker shades of orange and deep red are those areas where we had higher abundances of reef habitat or red snapper. So let's first look at these two maps. This is the comparison of natural reef habitat between interview information, again, the left map, and survey in model estimates that were fitted to survey data, the right-hand map. And if you squint your eyes over this full zone where we had coverage based on each of these data sets, you're looking at fairly good agreement between these two sets of data. The lighter shades of yellow and orange on the left-hand map are generally in agreement with the lighter shades of yellow and orange on the right-hand map. And correspondingly, the darker shades of orange and red, these are areas of greater abundance of reef habitat, also line up with greater areas of abundance of reef habitat on the right-hand side of the map. However, this wasn't a perfect match. There were some exceptions that I'd like to point out here. And these exceptions are shown in these wide blue arrows in each map. Specifically, the fishery stakeholders reported a greater amount of reef habitat coverage in grid cells off of Northeast Florida. And in contrast, when you look at that right-hand map compared to the interviews, the modeled estimates fitted to survey data are picking up on a greater amount of natural reef habitat in that shelf break region in the Carolinas, specifically and southward throughout Florida. Now, this pairing of maps is a comparison of red snapper relative abundance between interview and survey data. Again, the interview information is on the left map. The relative abundance from Nate et al.'s generalized additive modeling is in the right map. The lighter colors are, again, lesser relative abundance of red snapper based on either the interview process or the model fitting to surveyed estimates with the right-hand map. And again, squinting your eyes, this shows fairly good agreement between the interviewee information on the left and the relative abundance model fitting exercise on the right-hand side of the map, or the right-hand side of the screen. However, I do want to highlight a couple exceptions. We see a greater relative abundance reported by the interviewees compared to the modeled estimates. Specifically, you focus on that blue arrow in the upper left-hand side of the slide. You see that deep red blob in southern Onslow Bay, North Carolina, that's not showing up in the right-hand map. And in contrast, when you look at that right-hand map, those modeled survey estimates fitted to survey data, you see that deep red blob off the South Carolina, Georgia border, and also the deep red off of Northeast Florida that is not showing up as well in the interviewee information of red snapper relative abundance on the left-hand map. And finally, here's the paired maps that are comparing mapped grid cell information on red snapper relative abundance via the interview process. Again, that's the same, almost the same map that you're seeing from the previous two slides on the left-hand side of this slide, and we're now comparing it to the absolute abundance of red snapper in each of those grid cells from the current red snapper project, right-hand side of the slide. We're seeing, once again, fairly good agreement throughout the zone where we were able to collect both information both via the interview process and also via the absolute abundance estimation project on red snapper in the region. couple area of exceptions that I'd like to point out. This is very similar to the comparison of red snapper relative abundance that I showed you a couple slides ago. Specifically, we're still seeing this blob of deep red on the left-hand map via the interview information. This is again in southern Onslow Bay, North Carolina, that the absolute abundance estimator is not picking up on as well as the interview information. So we're seeing a greater reports from the interviewees of greater abundance of red snapper in southern Onslow Bay compared to the absolute abundance estimation project. And in contrast, when you look at those big blue areas on the right-hand map, we're seeing these two areas first off the South Carolina-Georgia border area, and also off northeast North Carolina, where there's a greater absolute abundance of red snapper compared to the information supplied by the interviewees on that map on the left-hand side of the slide. And so we had this information, this gridded colored information via these maps, but the next part of this is we really wanted to see, with each increasing level of an interview scoring either habitat coverage or red snapper relative abundance, did we see a step up or an increase, if you will, in these modeled estimates of habitat coverage or red snapper relative abundance or red snapper absolute abundance with increasing interviewee categorizations of habitat or red snapper? And so what we wanted to do is compare the modeled estimates that were from these published model fitting exercises, the estimated habitat coverage or red snapper relative or absolute abundance from these publications to see if there's differences among the interviewee habitat levels. And we did this with 3 separate analysis of variance or ANOVA model exercises. And let me walk you through the results from each of those 3 respective ANOVA model fitting exercises. The left-hand graph in this slide shows mean proportional habitat coverage on the y-axis versus interviewee habitat level on the x-axis. And we indeed see, with increasing interviewee habitat categorizations, we see this step up with, if you will, these increases in habitat coverage with increasing interviewee habitat categorizations. Similar patterns for graphs B and C. Graph B on the y-axis is mean red snapper relative abundance from that fishery-independent Chevron trap video survey annual estimate from the SURFs program. That's on the y-axis of panel B versus interviewee red snapper catch level on the x-axis. And a similar pattern to graph A, we're seeing this increase in mean red snapper relative abundance with increasing interviewee catch levels reported during that interview process. And again, a similar pattern in graph C compared to graph A and B, except this time in graph C on the y-axis is mean red snapper absolute abundance estimated from the current red snapper research project. That's on the y-axis versus interviewee categorizations of red snapper relative abundance on the x-axis. And we're seeing this increase, this dramatic increase in red snapper absolute abundance with increasing interviewee reports of red snapper relative abundance on the x-axis. So this, in my opinion, and I think my co-authors share this opinion, we're seeing this is really encouraging news that we're capturing via the interview process, we're capturing a step up or an increase, if you will, in the habitat coverage or red snapper abundance estimates reported from these model fitting exercises via these publications on reef habitat and red snapper abundance in the region. The next thing that we want to do, and this is my final result of the afternoon that I wanted to report on, is we had several areas where we had multiple fishery stakeholders providing interview information. And so what we wanted to look at in this final step of the results is to see, did we have cooperation between or among interviewees into their agreement on the quantity of habitat, the left-hand map, or the quantity, the categorizations of red snapper, the right-hand map, where we had these multiple interviewees participating in the project. Like the previous colored maps that I showed you, the lighter shades in each of these maps show the lighter shades are lesser variance for habitat, the left-hand map, or catch variance, the right-hand map. The darker shades are greater amounts of variance either between or among interviewees for each of the grid cells on the map. The gray grid cells on each of these maps are areas where, unfortunately, we could not collect multiple responses. There's just a single interviewee, so we couldn't estimate a variance for those particular grid cells shown in gray in each of the maps. So what we're seeing here, because there's lighter shading in the bulk of the gridded cells where we have colors in each of these maps, the left-hand map again being habitat, the right-hand map being catch, we're seeing generally good agreement between or among interviewees when they filled out these maps. And that's encouraging. But the one area where we did have a really notable exception when you focus in on these two maps is this left-hand map, where we had a pretty high variability between the interviewees that filled out grid cells off the South Carolina-Georgia border. We're seeing these deep orange and red shades in that region of the U.S. South Atlantic continental shelf. We think this is because we couldn't obtain more responses. We didn't get more interviewee participation in this region. Would more interviews have decreased the variability in that region of the shelf as far as their insights into habitat in that region? We think perhaps we could have reduced the variability in that region of the shelf if we had collected more stakeholder insights in that particular area. So where this project really fits in or breaks some new ground, in my opinion, a lot of studies, a lot of published studies, as you might imagine, a lot of people in the audience have probably heard of this thing called local ecological knowledge, and many studies in the marine realm in looking at the distribution and abundance of marine resources have used local ecological knowledge. But in contrast, really very few studies have used local ecological knowledge in concert with model fitting or estimates via model fitting to fishery-independent survey data. And so put that another way, what we had here at a disposal in our project is we had at our disposal the ability to see whether this local ecological knowledge or these fishery stakeholder insights, if you will, we had at our disposal the ability to see whether they cooperated the surveyed estimates, or vice versa, whether the surveyed estimates corroborated the fishery stakeholder insights. And indeed, we found that there was a good level of agreement between these two very different streams of data. And so that leads us to the opinion, the second bullet on this slide, that we believe local ecological knowledge can be a coarse or bird's eye substitute for surveyed estimates of marine resources in those many cases where survey data are not collected or collected intermittently in the many large marine ecosystems around the world. So some key messages, and again, many folks in the audience probably already know a lot of these messages, but just to drive some of these points home, that firstly, large marine ecosystems often suffer from a lack of comprehensive fishery-independent and fishery-independent data, but fishery-dependent stakeholder insights can help provide that information to understand what gaps what spatial gaps there might be in the distribution of these managed marine resources. Working relationships between researchers and fishery managers and fishery stakeholders are a coveted commodity. I was the point person in this project conducting the interview process, and this really, really drilled the point home in my mind that collecting this information was difficult, and getting stakeholder cooperation was a challenge, most principally because a lot of the stakeholders didn't have a working relationship with me or the other members of my research team. And so initiating and maintaining those relationships with fishery stakeholders is really a precious commodity, and we should, as a research and management community, we should really move or go to great lengths to maintain and foster those relationships, as I think the council members and the council staff does a really good job at in the management process in our reef fishery in this region. And finally, again, at risk of stating obvious, but it's worth reiterating that the U.S. South Atlantic is undergoing a period of really rapid change. Studies like this would provide a really good research template moving forward to use fishery stakeholder information in an interview process such as the one I demonstrated or I talked about this afternoon. For example, to look at the change in distribution of species like black sea bass and spiny lobster as a couple of the iconic reef associated species that appear like they might be undergoing some rapid changes in their spatial distributions on the U.S. South Atlantic continental shelf. And this kind of interview process can also be used moving forward to understand the spread of invasive species, for example, like the Pacific lionfish or the Asian tiger shrimp. And it would be really helpful to have this kind of rapid process where you could interview fishery stakeholders moving forward to early in those types of invasions to understand the spread and perhaps come up with some relatively rapid schemes to mitigate the spread of invasives such as the Asian tiger shrimp or lionfish moving forward. And I think that's my final slide. I'd like to acknowledge the folks in this slide for participating in the project. Again, they were Dr. Nathan Hostetter at NC State University and the U.S. Geological Survey, Jeffrey Merrill, one of my colleagues at the Center for Marine Sciences and Technology in Morehead City, North Carolina, the National Marine Fisheries Service and South Carolina Sea Grant for funding and administering the South Atlantic Red Snapper Research Program, the cooperating individual interviewees that we interviewed as part of this process, and Captains Wayne Dotson and Terrell Gould in Morehead City, North Carolina. And I think we'll withhold questions until after Brendan's portion of the lecture this afternoon, and I will turn it over to Brendan at this point in time.
Okay, Brendan, it should be coming to you.
All right, how are we looking, Chip?
Looking good. Can hear you well.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Chip, and thank you, Paul. I'm happy to be here to talk about recreational angler perceptions on where to vent barotraumatized reef fish. My name is Brendan Rundy. I'm a marine scientist with the Nature Conservancy. Thanks to my co-authors, Sean Sullivan, who was an undergraduate at North Carolina State University when we conducted this work, and is now a graduate student at University of Georgia. I think Sean's on the call today, so hi, Sean. Thanks for your hard work. And Paul, as well as Jeff Buckle at NC State for their assistance with this. To get a couple of acknowledgements out of the way, I first want to thank Jonna Brooks, who's another student at North Carolina State University. She is a talented artist in addition to a talented fishery scientist, and she drew a great image of a red snapper with barotrauma that we used for the surveys I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So I threw her Instagram up there. It's also her birthday today, so if you feel like dropping her an Instagram follow, I'm sure she would be both embarrassed and appreciative of that. Also want to thank Carolina Headboats LLC, the very same headboat on which Paul conducted some surveys that he just talked about. It was the platform for the surveys that in the presentation that I'm giving here. So many of the folks in the audience are probably familiar with barotrauma. Barotrauma is pressure-related injury. And in reef fish or snapper grouper species, such as those 4 species that are shown on the slide right now, barotrauma happens when the animal is pulled from the seafloor to the surface, usually during capture. It's a problem because the gases in the abdominal cavity or the swim bladder expand and can cause organ displacement and organ damage. And really the main concern with barotrauma is that when a fish is released for any number of reasons, it can be rendered floating and unable to resubmerge under its own power. So the red snapper in the lower right-hand image on the screen is a floating fish, and a floating fish, one way or the other, is going to wind up a dead fish. So there are a couple of ways that barotrauma can be mitigated or ameliorated, and I'm going to talk about one of those today. The one I'm not going to talk about, other than on this slide right now, is descender devices. This is not a descender device talk, but we have done, our research group, me, Paul, Jeff, done a lot of work on descender devices and how they can mitigate barotrauma and improve discard survival in species, including red snapper. The QR code on the screen will take you to our latest work on this topic that Paul was the lead author for. This is an investigation of hook location as well as descender device use in red snapper. So descender devices, that's all I'm going to say on those. Mostly what I'm going to talk about today is the other way that barotrauma can be mitigated, and that is with something called venting tools. Venting is essentially puncturing a barotraumatized fish to release or relieve the built-up gases in the abdominal cavity and swim bladder. Venting is usually accomplished by inserting a cannulated sharp object, such as the black-handled commercially available venting tool that's shown in the upper left, or a regular old hypodermic needle shown in the lower left, laterally into the side of the animal. The black sea bass on the screen is experiencing barotrauma, and you can see the black commercially available venting tool being inserted laterally. It's shown by the red arrow. For what it's worth, the green streamer coming out of the dorsal fin of that animal is a T-bar tag. So this is during a tagging study of black sea bass. And in general, surveys have found that venting tools are preferred over descenders by the fishery because they're generally faster to use and they are cheaper. Descending device can cost $60 or more. If it's lost, it has to be replaced. Venting tools are much, much cheaper than that. However, descender devices are in the regulations as required gear in the South Atlantic for vessels that are fishing for or possessing snapper grouper species, including red snapper and black sea bass that are shown on the screen. So if venting tools are preferred, then why are descender devices what's required? Well, there's been a refrain that that venting can cause more harm than good, that people, meaning participants in the fishery, don't know where to vent properly, and that people don't know how to vent properly. We have also seen, I personally have seen and received anecdotal reports of improper or what I call suboptimal venting tools being applied in a situation where a hypodermic needle or a real venting tool are more appropriate. So tools such as a rusty fillet knife or an ice pick have been applied to barotraumatized fish as a venting tool. This is probably not great, although no one has exactly tested the difference in those venting tools versus what's appropriate. So instead of condoning venting, the South Atlantic Council chose to condone descender devices. Once again, venting tools are preferred. So we sought to investigate whether people know how to vent, whether there's a familiarity among South Atlantic headboat anglers with venting. Do they know where anatomically to vent a fish? We wish to also update the results of a 2013 paper, Cyphers et al. 2013. The Cyphers et al. Paper was conducted in the Gulf. It was a survey of private anglers as well as tournament anglers. And because it was conducted, or published anyway, way back in 2013, it happened before a decade or more of intense outreach and education, in addition to scientific research on barotrauma and barotrauma mitigation. In the Cyphers paper, they conducted a survey where they showed an image of red snapper, in fact, the very image that I'm showing you on the screen now, and asked anglers to identify the location that they thought was ideal for venting fish. The white dots on the image at the bottom right of the screen are the responses from that Ciphers et al. Survey. The X is meant to indicate the area where, before barotrauma, the swim bladder, gas bladder would reside, which is to say that is the ideal location for venting. A couple of issues with this image. The first one is that it's in just a single two-dimensional image. There was no opportunity for the anglers to indicate on the ventral surface of the fish, the belly of the fish, that they thought that might be the ideal place for venting. And also, the red snapper in this image does not obviously have barotrauma. So I'll talk about how we improved upon that in a couple of slides. Our general methods were to go on the Carolina Princess headboat and survey individual anglers on that headboat with respect to their knowledge about venting and where to vent. Survey was conducted in 2023 and 2024, and the very first question at the top of the survey was, have you heard of venting? If an angler said they had not heard of venting, the survey was considered complete. We did not want to get perceptions of anatomical regions for venting from people who had never even heard of venting. However, if they had heard of venting, we continued with the survey. As the survey proceeded, the next question was, have you ever vented a fish? Regardless of the answer, yes or no, we continued to ask whether that person fished sometimes in the ocean on a private vessel. This will come into play later. And then finally, we asked the individual to mark on a diagram with an X where they believed was the ideal anatomical location for venting. So here's our improvement, what we consider an improvement on the Ciphers diagram. This is that image that I mentioned was drawn by Jonna Brooks. And once again, it's two views of red snapper. It shows a lateral view and a ventral view, thereby giving the respondent an opportunity to select either the lateral or the ventral view for the location they perceive to be ideal for venting. And also notice that the red snapper in the upper image has an everted stomach. So the stomach is coming out of the mouth. As a sidebar, a lot of individuals, anglers and others, participants in the fishery, believe that when there's an organ coming out of the mouth of an animal due to barotrauma, that is in fact the swim bladder. That's incorrect. What you're seeing coming out the mouth of the animal is the stomach. The swim bladder has expanded in the abdominal cavity, and it's caused the stomach to go inside out, to evert or invert, and it has then pushed the stomach out of the mouth. So what you're seeing there when you see a fish with an organ coming out of its mouth, what you're seeing is actually the inside of the stomach. This is most likely not the best place for venting to be applied. After we collected our responses from the survey respondents on where they thought the best anatomical region to vent was, we categorized those responses into 3 anatomical regions. The first anatomical region was based on X-ray images of a red snapper before barotrauma. This is from a paper that was published in 2005. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see 3 vertical images that basically show the same anatomical extent of the swim bladder in the surrounded by the dashed black line. So on our image, the solid black line shows what we're calling the proper region for venting. And this is, again, where the swim bladder resides before barotrauma. You'll notice that sharp vertical line, that sharp truncation at the back of the gill plate. That's because even though in a non-barotraumatized state, the swim bladder does extend anteriorly underneath the gill plate and underneath the gills, this is not an okay place to vent because you don't want to apply a venting tool through the gills, which are a vital organ for a fish. So again, that solid black line on our image reflects where the swim bladder is in an unbarotraumatized state, and it is the proper location for venting. We expanded that proper location to include what we call the likely proper location, which on our images is shown in the dashed black line. And that is derived from the decompressed, otherwise stated barotraumatized red snapper from medium, and high pressure from the Rummer and Bennett 2005 paper, you can see that the red arrows on the screen right now indicate the extent of the swim bladder all the way down to the bottom of the fish, the ventral aspect of the fish, when the animal has undergone barotrauma. The third area is everywhere else on the fish. Everywhere else is not a proper location for venting. So that would include the everted stomach, it would include anywhere near the gill plate, any of the musculature of the animal. Poking a needle into these areas may relieve gases that are built up in the fish's abdomen, but they are unlikely to be survivable. So now to jump into the beginning of the results here, we surveyed 567 anglers, of which 41%, or 232, had heard of venting. The remaining survey respondents had never heard of venting. Of those 232, 37% surveyed that they had experienced venting, and 46% of total respondents sometimes fish on a private vessel. So about half of headboat anglers that we surveyed do fish on a private recreational vessel, sometimes in the ocean. Okay, to get down to some harder sort of pin the tail on the red snapper results here, what I'm going to show you is anglers that had venting experience versus those that did not have venting experience. Keep in mind, all of these anglers had heard of venting, but only some of them had actually used venting before. The first image that I'm showing you that's on the screen right now is those anglers that have vented before. Of these responses, 12% had the proper location indicated. Another 54% were in the likely proper location, either in the lateral view or the ventral view. The remaining 34% indicated a location that is improper for venting. Most of these, as you can see, were in that everted stomach, that cluster of red points in the stomach that's poking out the mouth of the fish. This is an improper location for venting. So to compare those with venting experience to those that did not have venting experience, we see something very similar. Only 14% in the proper region, 43% in each of the likely proper and the improper regions. Again, with those red points, we see a cluster on the everted stomach. We also see a bit of a cluster around the cloaca or the anus of the fish. This is behind the area where the swim bladder, even in its barotraumatized expanded state, it's behind or posterior to that area where the swim bladder will reside. It's probably not going to accomplish the goal of venting, which is to relieve those built up gases and also not mortally wound the fish. We did not see a significant difference between the regional responses of people with venting experience and those without. I'm showing those results from the previous slide now in a bar chart form. A chi-squared test found that there was no significant difference between people with experience venting and people without experience venting in terms of which region they selected. This conclusion means that we're okay to proceed with these results, lumping them together. We're now going to look at the same thing with those respondents that had private vessel experience and those respondents that did not have private vessel experience. So for the people that did have private vessel experience, it's a very similar story. 13% in the proper region, 49% in the likely proper, and 38% in the improper region, with clusters of red points in two very familiar locations. For respondents that did not have private vessel experience, 13% proper, 39 likely proper, and 48 improper. Again, a cluster there on the everted stomach. Similar story with chi-squared test. We did not see a significant difference. Private vessel experience does not appear to influence their regional selection of the area that the angler felt was ideal for venting. Same conclusion, we can analyze these groups together. So without splitting by vessel experience and without splitting by venting experience, looking at all the results combined, we have 13% selecting a proper region, we have 47% selecting a likely proper region, and 40% of respondents choosing an anatomical region that they thought was ideal for venting, but is in fact an improper location for applying a venting tool to mitigate barotrauma. So some discussion and overall findings here. 59% of respondents had not heard of venting. 40% of respondents that had heard of venting selected improper locations. Therefore, for the survey overall, 24%, less than 1/4 of respondents, had both heard of venting and selected a location that is proper or likely proper. This is a little bit of an alarming result that only 1/4 of the recreational fishers surveyed both know about venting and can do it properly. I'm comparing here the CIFER's survey responses with the survey responses from our study. One thing to point out is that we had a much higher, a much larger cluster of points around the everted stomach than the CIFER's paper did. I would hypothesize that that's because we showed an everted stomach and they did not. So we consider that an improvement. We also had a number of points, as you can see, on the ventral aspect of the animal. So again, I think an improvement on the at least in terms of the diagram used to survey respondents. So some caveats. It's not clear whether the headboat anglers we surveyed are representative of the private recreational fishery, but half of the respondents in our survey do sometimes fish on private vessels in the ocean. North Carolina is where we conducted this survey on a single headboat. North Carolina may not be representative of the overall South Atlantic coast in terms of respondents' knowledge of venting and where on a fish to apply it. We also are unsure if likely proper locations, the blue dots on our two diagrams, are appropriate locations or perhaps inappropriate locations to apply venting in terms of the survival, the eventual post-release survival of the animal. I'll say more about that on the next slide, but a conclusion here is that if venting is to be condoned, outreach efforts really need to be ramped up in the South Atlantic. Again, right now, venting is not the preferred or at least not the condoned barotrauma mitigation method by the South Atlantic Council. Descender devices are. And so if venting were to make its way into the regulations as an option for anglers, we really need to make sure that the fishers know not to poke an everted stomach and know where that swim bladder resides within a barotraumatized fish. Some good news is that the North Carolina Sea Grant recently funded a follow-up study to this survey work, which would be a field study in which we will explicitly test the survival of red snapper in after a number of different release treatments, recompressed with a descender device, and then vented in the proper location, vented in one of several likely proper locations, and then vented in one of several improper locations. These will be compared alongside an untreated surface release control. So we're looking forward to getting that study in the water and looking forward to updating everyone after we have field results from that acoustic telemetry study that we're hoping to start here in calendar year 2026. So Trip, my last slide is this one, which is to say that this paper is published, the survey paper is published. Paul was the lead author on that. I'm grateful for Paul allowing me to present it today. And the QR code that's on the screen at the moment will take you to that paper at North American Journal of Fisheries Management. It is an open access paper, so you should not have any issue with a paywall being able to read the full paper and the full findings thereof. So with that, I appreciate the time to briefly discuss this survey work, and I will yield to Chip so that he can moderate Q&A and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan and Paul, and let me work on getting control back. All right, just to go over how to operate a webinar again, just real quickly. If you're in on a computer and using the new version of GoToWebinar, here are the different functions that it has, with the important ones being the hand raised. If you want to speak, click on the hand raised under React. If it turns white, that means your hand is raised. We'll recognize you, unmute you through the webinar. Make sure your microphone is unmuted when it's your opportunity to speak. And then if you don't want to necessarily speak, you have an opportunity to enter a question. Click on the question box up here, and then you're typing your question right here. If you're on a phone, Once again, going through these, you have your microphone bottom left. You want the microphone to be white. That's going to indicate that it's able to speak. If you'd like to speak aloud, click on the 3 dots and you'll go over to the hand icon and click that. Or once again, top right, you can type in the question into the question log. Using the more traditional webinars, we have the question box at the bottom of this control panel. Your hand will be here. If it's green, that means your hand is down, red is raised. And then when you want to speak, your microphone should turn green. If it's red, that means you're muted. So if you'd like to ask a question, please go ahead and raise your hand. And while you're doing that, there was a question that came into the question box from one of the attendees, and let me pull that up real quick. It was for you, Paul. Paul made a great point. Working relationships between researchers and fishery stakeholders are a coveted commodity. What advice do you have for other non-social scientists on this topic? Can you offer any specific lessons learned that could be of use to others?
Again, just some really course level stuff, and I appreciate the question. I've been doing cooperative research for a long time. Is to I might be a little bit of a unicorn because I do have a PhD, and I'm still despite that terminal degree, I'm still very active in the field, and just I'm not lambasting the behavior of other PhD folks that are often extremely tied down to the computers and extremely busy with very cutting edge science. But if I had any one bird's eye recognition, again, it doesn't even matter what level of aptitude or university training you have, whether you have a bachelor's degree, you don't have university training, or you have a master's, or the terminal doctorate degree, is to hit the street as much as possible, to get to know people, and go out in boats that you might not otherwise go out on, make phone calls that you might not otherwise make, just to get to know the players in any particular fishery that you as a researcher might be involved in. That is super helpful. It's hard to do sometimes to break the ice outside of an established or a funded research project, but just making that little bit of additional effort to get to know people and reach out to people, in either formal settings like established research projects, or informal settings, just showing up at a dock and picking people's brain on a Saturday afternoon. So I would again just encourage people to step outside of their own comfort boxes, whether that's in a lab setting or an office setting, and make that additional effort to get to know people in the field setting. And I think that goes a long way sometimes into initiating and also cultivating those types of relationships. And I've got high mileage out of those, those type of contacts in my past research years over my time with NC State University.
Chip, do you mind if I say something on that topic?
Yeah, go ahead.
In some fields, I'm thinking of medical fields, there's something called continuing education, where in order to maintain your license, you have to take some classes, learn about updated technology, updated methodologies. And I often think that in our field, people who are in jobs that are resource management jobs, where you're charged with understanding and managing a public resource, there should be some sort of requirement. Instead of continuing education, it should be like continuing to have your finger on the pulse of what's actually happening on the water. And that could be, maybe there's not a great way to formalize that, but it could be something like, in order to maintain your resource management profession, you have to interact with stakeholders in some way a certain number of times annually. I myself am one of those people that Paul's referring to, who's tied to the computer more and more and less in the field. than I would like to be, and certainly less than I used to be. But I still get out a few times a year, and I always learn something when I'm doing cooperative research from the people who are driving the boat, the people who are operating that vessel. So I certainly agree with Paul that trying to stay grounded and trying to stay in the field and interacting with the stakeholders is super important. It's critical, really, to managing resources.
And I'll just dovetail in with Brendan's comment, Chip, if I may.
Yeah.
Just to follow with Brendan's comment, we've seen on this unfortunate cutback over the last several years, I guess, into cooperative research funding, because that's still, in my opinion, as you know, someone that's been in this line of work for several decades of my life, is still the most ready-made type of networking you can do in marine research. If the funding agency is mandating that you work with a cooperator, then you have it, you know, you have no excuses to cultivating or initiating and or cultivating contacts with fishery stakeholders. So that's a easily packaged way to maintain these working relationships. And again, just perhaps speaking for myself, but I think most folks in the audience would agree with me, when you see these cutbacks to cooperative research funding, that really definitely curtails for most researchers the ability to initiate and maintain these kind of working relationships with fishery stakeholders.
Yeah, and I know we have Julia on, who's in charge of our citizen science program, and that really understands the importance of developing these relationships in order to get some of the science from the stakeholders themselves. There was another question typed into the question log. Is there an expectation for anglers to vent fish themselves aboard the Carolina Princess? I know on many trips, the mates tended to be more responsible for the venting.
Yes, so there's not an expectation. The expectation, I think, to the point you just made, Chip, is that the professional paid mates on those headboat trips, at least the Princess trips that I participated in, I can't speak for other headboats in the region, will do that. The one caveat that I did notice, which is completely understandable, is when you have a full boat or some semblance of a full boat, and let's say in the Princess, a full boat entailed having 3 paid mates. Those mates at the capacity of a full boat, you know, they can only work so fast. And so oftentimes, you know, there's a window of opportunity, you know, when an animal with gills needs to be returned to the water to have, you know, to give it a reasonable chance of survival. So you know, there are times on the Princess, even though there's an expectation that the mates will perform the venting service for the paying customers, that there's a time window that sometimes can get exceeded because the mates are busy with, you know, doing other things for the paying patrons of the boat.
Thank you. And there was a similar question asking why the mates on the headboats were not surveyed. In their experience, they do most of it. And I was just curious, just to riff on their question a little bit. Did you all talk to the mates, and how did the mates seem to perform as far as identifying the proper areas to vent?
Yeah, we talked to the mates. They weren't part of the survey, but my extensive knowledge of how they vented and where they vented, and me watching them perform the actual venting process, was in to the slides that Brendan brought up this afternoon, was in the proper location. So it was completely seamless. It was in what we would describe as researchers in the proper location.
Thank you. So let's go to Julia, and then Haley, and then Jimmy. Julia?
Hey, Brendan and Paul, thanks so much for the presentations and kind of this research and all of the things you were saying earlier about the, the importance of building relationships with folks in the fishing community to kind of help answer a lot of these research questions was really well said. And so, Paul, my question is for you, and I thought kind of that work where you compared the stakeholder interviews with kind of that fishery independent data was really interesting, and it's really good to see so much kind of similar information coming out of the interviews and kind of that modeling work. But my question was more specific about kind of how you identified and selected the folks to interview in that project. And then you mentioned you did kind of commercial and recreational folks, and I was interested also in, for the recreational component, was it kind of for hire captains, anglers, private recreational anglers, if it was kind of a mix of what we consider recreational, or if it kind of was leaned heavily towards kind of one recreational sector over another?
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Julia. To start with the last question first, it was definitely a mix of different types of modes that the recreational fleet participates in, both the for hire and the private recreational modes for the recreational folks. There was an approximately equal number of interviewee respondents between the two fleets, the commercial versus the recreational fleet that exploit reef fishes in the region. So that was an approximately equal 50-50 mix. In the initial way that I identified potential respondents was actually working with you all, the council folks. And the very first thing, not surprisingly, that I started with was at the time the current list of snapper grouper advisory panel members. And we exploited that list or harvested interviewees from that list heavily. And I would say off the top of my head, Julia, that roughly half of the respondents that we got, the interviewees that we got as part of the project, were indeed at the time, and some of course still are, council snapper grouper AP members. The additional folks that we were able to interview as part of the process were, to some degree, direct fishery associates of those snapper grouper AP members, or once removed, a friend of a friend, if you will, of those snapper grouper AP members. And we validated for each of those interviewees, we kind of did a cursory initial, what I call meet and greet, to get an understanding into their level of reef fishing experience in the region before we conducted the formal interview process.
All right, we'll go to Haley. Haley, you should be unmuted. There you go.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. Brennan, thank you so much for the presentation. Dr. Paul, thank you so much for your continued work and advocating on behalf of best fishing practices. We know it's really important. And yeah, just to reiterate what some of the other folks have said, cooperative research certainly is a coveted commodity. I thought it was really interesting the way that this research was set up, particularly surrounding a single headboat. I guess it varies throughout the region, but it's worth noting that guests very rarely are handling their own fish. And per Coast Guard regulations, there is a specific number of crew to paying passengers. So if you have 100 people on board and only 3 crew members, well, you've got a much bigger problem than not venting fish. I will say that a lot of the headboats I work with do prefer the descending device. So we see a lot of success on that. And I guess getting to my question, you know, the caveat is that headboats are willing to participate in that cooperative research based on the high levels of accountability already. And from a social and socioeconomic perspective, there is this kind of perception sometimes that headboats aren't cool, that they're for poor people. So depending on how the survey was presented, to say, oh yeah, hey, do you fish on private boat? Maybe there's pressure to say, yeah, I fish on private boats. You know, I'm not just stuck on this old stinky headboat. But I was wondering if there was any validation to when the anglers said, yes, I do fish on private boats.
Hey, Haley, Brendan here. Thanks for the question. So no, definitely no validation to that. I should have mentioned that this was at least for the venting survey work, it was completely unfunded work. So we had this idea, we did not receive external funding for it, and we had to accomplish it basically as smoothly as possible with the limited resources that we had. And so that's essentially why this was conducted on a single headboat and on headboat trips at all, because it was a means to an end as far as accessing a large number of anglers that were private recreational fishers. And also the nice thing about the headboat is that, you know, you might have 50 or 70 people who are a captive audience on the ride out and the ride in. Whereas if you did try to access the private recreational sector at even say a public boat launch, no one's going to answer your questions when they're launching in the morning, and a lot of people, as I'm sure our colleagues at the resource management agencies know, a lot of people aren't going to want to answer your questions on the back end either. So I think that hopefully answers your question. There isn't really a way, I don't think, to validate people's responses as far as whether they fish on a private vessel. I think that there are ample opportunities for future work on this topic. But we did the best with what we had.
I'll take a moment to follow up if I could, Chip and Haley.
Sure.
Yeah, Haley, I conducted, I'm laughing kind of sadly about answering your question, because I conducted, starting last year, a follow-up to the headboat survey at a very, very busy public launch ramp site for folks that have their own private recreational fishing vessels and launch out of the Morehead City, Beaufort area of North Carolina. And to Brandon's point he just made, it was a smashing lack of success. There were extremely few folks willing to participate. And so there could be, you know, a validation study would be really helpful. But if you're trying, the researcher or the manager's trying to get an understanding or a snapshot into the level of knowledge of venting, like we did in headboat with a private recreational fishing mode, I think this is going to be something that's very difficult to do due to folks that were not particularly interested in cooperating with my Saturday afternoon surveys at least at that particular boat ramp in that particular state. So the captains of the Carolina Princess, getting them to sell the idea for their cost of paying customers to participate in me and Sean and Brendan and Jeff Buckle's survey was extremely helpful. And without that level of, you know, captains selling the interview process at the private, you know, at a public boat ramp with private recreational fishers, made my ad hoc interviews about venting knowledge almost impossible when I tried it a year or so ago.
All right, thank you. And I see we have a couple questions in the question log, and we'll get to those in just a second. Let's go to Jimmy Hall first.
Hello.
Hey.
Yeah, Jimmy Hall, South Atlantic Council, Florida Commercial Seat. Paul and Brendan, great presentation on the habitat distribution. It pretty much lined up with the way I thought it would. There was quite a bit of agreement, and it was good to see that showing up. So was glad of that. As far as the venting, I have a question for Brendan. So ever since 2009, the state of Florida, FWRI, has done a lot of cooperative tagging of red snapper, thousands and thousands of animals, and I've participated in a lot of that, and have retrieved a lot of those animals again. So my question is, obviously, when we tag those animals cooperatively with biologists on the boat, you know, they are treated, they're vented and tagged. And so on the retrieved tags, have you ever been able to dig in and see how they were treated, and if they able to deduce the percentage of survivorship from the retrieved tags? Because I mean, if we only have 24% of recreational anglers are properly venting, that's alarming. And then we really need to know, you know, how effective overall the survivorship of venting. And we can assume, I think, that when it's done by a biologist, it's done properly. So that's my question.
Hey, Captain. Yeah, thanks for the question. So the FWRC tagging program is outside the scope of the talk. I know we have some folks who conduct that program as audience members today, but I don't think we have time, unfortunately, to put them on the spot. There have been some analyses of that very, very useful data set conducted to look at the difference in survival of red snapper and other species that have undergone various types of barotrauma mitigation. So if it's okay with you, Captain Jimmy, I'll connect you with the FWRC folks after this seminar, just because I feel like it's out of scope for the venting survey question at this time.
All right, I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. And Chip, if I may, just a couple other comments.
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, the conclusion that the council needs a lot more outreach. I think that, of course, we do. We always need more outreach, but we really don't have, you know, the states do have recreational licensing. And it seems to me that that's where, you know, when they get their license, that's when the outreach needs to happen. And maybe some type of video they have to watch or something on proper venting. You know, at the federal level, we don't have any type of licensing. And then, you know, in my experience in life, small animals get vented, big animals get descended. That's generally how it goes on my boat. And of course, I fully support cooperative research and data collection, and agree that it is something that we really need to continue. So thanks for the presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So there was one question, and I think you guys have already addressed this. Curious if the Princess's mates completed the targeting survey, and if so, how did they do? I covered that, didn't we?
I think we covered that.
Yes, we covered it, Chip, that they did not do the survey, but they were, based on my extensive experience on the boat before the survey commenced, or we even concocted a survey with Jonna Brooks's images. I indeed validated that they had plenty of experience and were indeed venting live animals in the proper location.
Great, thank you. And then there was a question, do you have ideas for how local ecological knowledge, like the stuff you discussed in the first presentation, might be incorporated into management?
I don't, Chip, because I'm not a manager. Can I throw that one back at you? I don't want to be speaking out of tongues. Really, my realm has been and still is mostly research. So that's a good question for any manager on the line, and I would be interested in their opinion without putting any of them on the spot. I think there's probably folks in the audience that are better served to answer that question than I am.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not afraid to speak out of turn. So I will do my best. And, you know, thinking about the example that you provided here was looking at habitat maps. And I think one of the key parts in thinking about how this local ecological knowledge could be incorporated is tying it into a species like mutton snapper. Although it's controversial, some of the closed areas for that species, you know, closing some of the areas down off South Florida, it seems to have been very effective. And some of the ideas on where to close came from fishermen. It was them identifying that as an important spawning area, and it being and then going through the management process in order to get it incorporated as a closed area and a protected area for spawning. So local ecological knowledge can provide a lot of things. You know, it can give us information on distribution changes. If you look at a project called Red Map that's done in Australia, and one of the project co-investigators of it is now up at UNC and working with us on another project. But they were able to identify species moving into new areas, and maybe that can be helpful as the council figures out how to manage these species while they move along. If other folks have some ideas on how this could be incorporated into management, please raise your hand and speak up. Shouldn't just be me throwing out random ideas. I'd like to hear from others.
Chip, I will just briefly, while maybe some other managers are going to weigh in, just reiterate to follow up from the research, not the management, but the research perspective. These estimates of natural reef, or aka live bottom habitats, were absolutely essential to make best estimates or more accurate estimates of the number, the absolute number of red snapper on the U.S. South Atlantic continental shelf as part of the current red snapper research program. So we needed, again, to use this interview process to make sure we weren't missing any big gaps in the coverage of natural reef habitat that were being overlooked by fishery-independent sampling programs.
Yeah, that's another great example. Haley, I see you have your hand up.
Hey, thank you guys. Not so much a question, but perhaps something to think about for the future. Again, a huge supporter of cooperative research. I know how important it is and support it in every way that we can. Maybe in the future, if something like this were to come up again, interviewing headboat participants, something along the lines of if they're native to the area or if they're visiting. You know, a lot of the headboat towns are tourist towns. So I wouldn't expect a family from Michigan to be familiar with where they're venting their fish. You know, they look to us and the crew and their expertise to handle that stuff for them. But, you know, maybe just a couple extra steps of where they're from, how often they bottom fish, to help gather some more data. Thank you.
All right, well, we're right at 2:30, so that's the time for the seminar. I really appreciate everybody coming to listen to the presentation. I'd like to thank both Paul and Brendan for some great presentations on the work that they've been doing, gathering insights from stakeholders, and we really appreciate the information that was gathered and the time that the stakeholders took to work with the researchers. I think that's an important component in all of this, being able to work together to figure out the best solutions and answers to many of the questions that we have here in the South Atlantic. So with that, I'm going to close the webinar, and you all have a great afternoon, and thank you again for attending.